Thanks,
Kick off
Carlene.
from there.
Wonderful. Well, we won't wait any longer. We'll just hop right into it. Thank you, everyone, for joining today for the Safety Day session on environmental health and safety with alumni Kim Williams. Just a reminder, I think everybody is following the housekeeping notes of leaving your microphone turned off and your video turned off to preserve the bandwidth. We appreciate that. You did receive the quiz with the questions for this session in advance. So if you wanted to open them up and answer the questions as we go through the session, that's a good option for you to have today if you'd like to do that. With that, I think we'll just hop right into it. So I will just quickly acknowledge that while we are gathering virtually, we acknowledge that the university is on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, and we pay our respects to the First Nations and the Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And now I will introduce Kim Williams. You may have read her bio already, but Kim is one of ours. She is an alumni from the Department of Chemical Engineering, and she is currently the Vice President of EH&S Regulatory and Security at Ovintiv Canada. She joined Ovintiv as a 19-year-old USask chemical engineering student and spent her early career learning the business from the ground up in a variety of engineering roles that included production, reservoir development, facilities, and strategic planning. In 2010, she took on her first formal leadership role and was promoted again only 2 years later. As a newly minted senior manager, Kim has helped her teams navigate some of the Canadian oil and gas industry's darkest days. She led the Canadian operations portion of Ovintiv's portfolio transformation, accomplishing over $5 billion in property divestitures. In the next few years, she further proved her combined talents for building teams and achieving results. And in 2019, she was named Encana's first ever female Vice President of Environmental Health and Safety, Regulatory Affairs, and Security. And Encana was, of course, the name before they rebranded as Ovintiv, if anyone wasn't aware of that change of name. In her free time, Kim serves as the principal oboist, in 2 Calgary bands. Correct me if I'm wrong with that, Kim. Both of which perform concerts in the community throughout the year. Kim and her husband Zane enjoy camping, traveling, scuba diving, and fishing together with their 2 dogs, Cooper and Doug. So thank you, Kim, so much for being here. We look forward to hearing what you have to share for our students today.
It's great. Thank you so much, Rochelle. I'm just gonna share up my screen here and we will get started. All right. Just make sure I can still see on this side. There we go. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate getting the chance to come back and talk to people that I feel like I know. And so a bit of a welcome home moment for me. Really appreciate it. So we just want to start the meeting true safety style with a quick safety moment. This is exactly what we do in our company every time we have a meeting, just on the topic of, I don't know, what's a good one here? Probably winter storm. Hopefully we don't have any more winter storms, but if we do, you know, it'll be a doozy in March. And so, you know, you can all hear that little voice in your head of someone you know saying, check your battery, minimize your travel, keep that fuel full, and check on road conditions before you leave. I think the other one that is really important when it's cold is just to remember that cold reduces your thirst instinct. And so it's really easy to get dehydrated in the cold too. So keep an eye out for that. So I just wanted to kind of start with a little bit about myself and try and plug in a little bit about who I am. And so, of course, a U of S chemical engineering alum. I've worked at Ovintiv now for 22 years. I started, as it said, as a summer student. I think really when I think about all of the things that I've done at this company, you know, they've all kind of built on one another, different roles kind of leading to more advanced roles and then into leadership. And people on the screen here and dogs on the screen is kind of, you know, part of my life, is that the things that are really important to me. And you can kind of see pictures of my family as well as my furry friends, my furry dogs. That's Doug and Cooper. This is when we were working from home earlier with COVID. They were both employees of the month in March and April 2020, respectively. And so we just like to have a good time and really enjoy things. Just want to stop over here with my mom and dad. My mom and dad just got their second COVID vaccines, and so we're hoping that that means we can see them soon. And so I'm sure a lot of you are going through the same thing. Next slide I wanted to go over was a little bit on our company, Ovintiv. Not a lot of people know who we are because we, as you mentioned, changed names recently from Encana. Well, Encana is the company that I started with, which was called Pan Canadian at the time, Pan Canadian Petroleum. But really, we're North America's one of the oldest oil and gas natural producers. And you can see a picture on this slide of a place called Langevin Siding in 1883. That's just outside the town of Brooks, so just east of Brooks, Alberta, a few miles and a few miles south. You know, our roots as a company go back to the 1800s when the Canadian Pacific Railway was drilling wells for water alongside the train tracks and, you know, for stops to be able to refill their boilers and such. Well, when they were drilling this well for water, they actually ended up striking natural gas, and they ended up burning the rig down, having a fire, and someone jumped off the rig and broke his leg. It made the Calgary paper. Actually, you can find that article if you search through the archives, which is kind of cool. But that's really how the whole company was born. That was the very first natural gas well discovered in the province, and eventually the CPR had a branch of the company called Canadian Pacific Oil and Gas, which ended up changing hands and becoming Pan Canadian Petroleum. And then, you know, all the various mergers and acquisitions and things that have happened since ended up with Ovintiv. We changed our name in 2000, in early part of 2000. And our purpose as a company, we say, is to make modern life possible for all. So that means, you know, providing energy to people who need energy to bring up their standard of living or to just live their lives day to day. Our teams really stand by a commitment to drive progress and continuously improve things in people's lives. Our business model, really, we look at generating value for our shareholders through the quality of our assets, our ability to be really efficient in the way that we operate, use some capital discipline, and then that relentless focus on innovation, I'd say, is kind of the third pillar. If you think about energy, our lives today and energy are inextricably linked. You know, from the clothes that we wear, the technology we use, the phones we carry, everything has oil and gas at its root. And so that's really something that, you know, as the world starts to transition to different energy sources over time, there's still going to be an importance of oil and gas in that. And that's where we see our future as a company. Now, lots of people ask about our name. What does Ovintiv mean? What's an Ovintiv? Well, an Ovintiv is a made-up word for sure, but it really represents our commitment to continuous innovation, and that's with the O at the start. That that circle of never-ending improvement is kind of where it came from, and then it's a little bit of a play on words as well. Our logo, what you see on all the slides here, also represents kind of the human connections that are made possible by the energy that we produce. So that's a question I get a lot, so I figured I would just hit it straight up front. But if you think a little bit about, you know, what we do as a company, we like to call ourselves, this is just a slide straight out of our latest investor relations deck, talking about us being a new E&P, new energy and production company. Well, what does that mean? Well, really, you know, you see here our assets on the map are located across North America. In Canada, we have a play called the Montney, which is in both Alberta and British Columbia, kind of covers both parts of the provinces there. And we also have assets across the US. We have in North Dakota, we have the Bakken play. In Texas, we have an Eagle Ford play as well as a Permian play. And then in Oklahoma, we have what we call the Anadarko play. So we kind of have assets spread across North America, and you can see some of our highlights there. I'm not going to go through them, but really we're one of the largest independent energy producers in North America. And, you know, where we pride ourselves is having some of the best assets that generate, you know, really significant value for our shareholders. We're working on our financial health right now as a company. We have some debt that we're trying to reduce is kind of our number one goal right now, as well as just, you know, keeping the most efficient operation we can possible and driving our capital efficiency. So, of course, as safety, I'll tell you how that all plays into it, but you can't, you know, we always talk about a good and efficient business is a safe business and vice versa. They go hand in hand, definitely. And I can tell you that from experience now in my career. But a lot of people ask me, what do I do as a VP of EH&S Regulatory and Security? Well, I'm lucky to be able to report to an awesome boss who's the Chief Operating Officer of the company, Greg Givens. I have the honor of leading 5 directors at my table, as well as have an executive assistant, and we have a broader team underneath the 5 directors of about 112. We basically look after all of the operating areas. So those areas you saw on the map, each one kind of has its own safety and environmental performance management through those 5 directors, as well as, we're focused overall on our management system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We call that ethos, and I'll give you more on that. But really, we also look after the maintenance of that system and audit of our practices. We also have our operational EH&S team. They're kind of the middle of the team, and they kind of create the policy that everyone else implements. The security team is also part of my overview. So we have physical security assets. So we have people to take care of. Obviously, we have 3 major corporate offices, one in Calgary, one in Denver, and one in Houston, Texas. And so we have assets to take care of there. We also have hundreds of thousands of field sites. We probably have about 4 major field offices in the different areas, as well as, like I said, hundreds of sites at each one of those locations. And so it's a lot to look after from a security perspective as well. Our team also deals with any emergency responses that we have. So if we do have an event that is deemed an emergency, we help manage that emergency, as well as we have a business continuity event. So what's a good example of that would be the flood in Calgary in 2013, when we were unable to access our Calgary office for over a month. How do you manage through that? That's what business continuity planning is about, is managing through that. We also, of course, have the huge environmental file, which of course gets a lot of attention, especially recently, is kind of ramping up in attention, is part of, environmental. We think of that as our emissions performance, our water usage. We think of that as how much we recycle water, also our spill, how much we spill on the ground. Those are all kind of components of our environmental management. We'll talk more about that. We also look after, right now, topic of choice is COVID-19. Pandemic response is on our screen. And so if anyone remembers back to swine flu, previous pandemics, every time something like this pops up, this comes into our wheelhouse of management. And so I'm part of a pandemic response team at the company. My whole team stands behind me, and we work on, how we keep people. Of course, you may have noticed I'm in my office. We've been back in the office here in Calgary for a number of months. It depends on your position right now in Calgary and what your business need is to be in the office or not. We do have a mix, but I have been back in the office since June of last year. And I can tell you, if you're having any fear or anxiety about getting back into society, it can be done safely. It's all about protocols. And luckily, we've got vaccines on the horizon as well, which is bringing a lot of hope. All right. So practically speaking, what does my job look like? Well, it looks like I spend a lot of time on the road. In a normal year, I would spend the majority of my time traveling. I have an office in each of our 3 offices, and I split my time between the 3 and all of our field sites. And so I spend a lot of time with other people. Is kind of my job, is asking questions and learning about what people do and looking for challenges, looking for opportunities for my team to work on. And so some of the other really cool projects I've been involved with over the years. I've been involved with some of our partners that we have. We have a joint venture partnership in our Canadian assets with Mitsubishi, who is based in Tokyo, Japan. And so I've had the fortunate of being invited to visit their head office and speak to them about some of our initiatives and projects. I've been on multiple strategy teams in the company. It's a really cool kind of way to solve problems in our company, is to bring together an interdisciplinary team of folks to tackle strategic issues. And so I've had the pleasure of being on 3 or 4 of those. And that means a lot of travel, because you're getting to know some of the folks that you're on the team with. I think the other thing here too is I spend a lot of time with our board of directors. And so the board of directors of Ovintiv is 12 or 13 members now. And every quarter we spend time with them, explaining to them where the company's at, getting approvals for certain things that we need from the board, And really lately, it's been a lot of education around climate and emissions and spending time on that file with them. And so, there's a picture at the bottom right here of us out in Oklahoma. We took them out on a field tour. This is before COVID, but really taking them out and letting them see our field operations and ask questions and gain education on our business. So I think that's cool. The last thing I'd point out is just volunteerism is really big at our company. We have a lot of internal programs where we call them Let's Volunteer With, and insert name of any leader. And so I try and do those at least 2 or 3 times a year, where we get a bunch of people together and we go out and try and do something really practical for a volunteer organization in our communities. So it's kind of what it looks like day to day for my role at this company. So I promised you a little bit of information on how we do safety management. And we talk about safety management systems. Well, Ovintiv has an operations management system that we call Ethos, and we call it our operational excellence system. What's Ethos? Yet another name that we use that is a little vague, but really Ethos is defined as a characteristic spirit or guiding belief and values of a community, people, or system. And that's how we see operations management at our company. It's really a community-based system. Our guiding belief is that any job can be done safely with sound environmental stewardship. And together, those beliefs really permeate the spirit of our organization. And so Ethos is our operations management system. Well, what is that? It's kind of a structured and documented set of interdependent standards and practices and processes, procedures that are used at kind of every level to manage any operational risk. And we're going to talk quite a bit about risk, but really it's that framework that clearly states how we will conduct our business, knowing that risk is always present. And what you see here on the page is a little bit of a description of kind of the hierarchical nature of our Ethos system, coming straight down from the very top, from our board of directors, our president, CEO, as well as our executive leadership team, down into our operational EH&S team, which reports into me, and then down into our directors and managers, and down into our operating areas in particular. When we think about, governance, that's at the very top. Ethos is stewarded by the EH&S committee of the board, which I said I report to quarterly, as well as to our executive leadership team. We're committed to operational excellence by operating in the most efficient, safe, and cost-effective manner that we can. But really, it's through this systematic system of 12 standards. And so the 12 standards, I'm not going to go through them because this is a lot of verbs, but they're really key categories of operational risk that need to be managed. And I really like to think about it as Ethos is really integrated into our day-to-day operations and decision-making processes. So if I think about, one of the 12 standards is around audit. And so if I think about audit on a day-to-day basis, we have a certain amount of audits that we are required to do. It's set by the board every year, and we go and we complete those audits and we report back quarterly to the board on the results of those audits. Any corrective actions that we're taking as a result, whether it's paperwork or it's actual implemented, in the field. And so there's a lot of different standards, and they look a lot like things that if you look after, you can manage risk well in the organization. So it kind of leads me to risk. And we've said the word risk a couple times already, but I like to think about this in ways of how do you manage risk? Well, thinking about the pyramid on the left here, this is called the Heinrich pyramid, and it really shows the relationship between unsafe acts, all the way from minor incidents, all the way to major incidents and fatalities. And you can see here, you have a lot of unsafe acts for every fatality. And so knowing that about safety and safety management, our goal as safety professionals is to try and keep everything into that unsafe act and try and minimize that, because by doing that, you'll minimize the number of events you have going up the pyramid. And so when we look at the ratio that Heinrich kind of first talked about, he said, based on his research, for every 300 unsafe acts, there are 29 minor injuries and 1 serious injury or fatality. And so it's a very interesting ratio. There's lots of debate about it. But really, at the end of the day, if you rack up a lot of numbers in the purple part of the pyramid, the predictive ratio tells you it's only a matter of time before you have one in the red and see that more serious outcome. And again, a lot of people debate these ratios and whether it's true or not, but at the end of the day, it's a risk-based approach to safety. And that's what's paramount here, is identifying what high-risk practices or scenarios that have not previously been recognized or corrected that are occurring in your organization and finding a way to do that. And so at Ovintiv, we analyze all of our incidents, but especially the ones we call them the ones where we got lucky. So the ones where the most severe outcome didn't occur, but it was really just luck that prevented that from being a more serious outcome. And we call those high potential incidents, or hypos. We kind of shorthand it. So what you see on the right here is how we use what we call our 10 life-saving rules to help everyone focus on what matters most in preventing all of these incidents. Hazards that quite often end up in serious injury or fatality result because generally a life-saving rule has been broken. So there's 10 of them. They're quite easy to remember. They have the same graphics in them. A lot of safety organizations use these exact same graphics, if not the exact same verbiage. So it's kind of handy no matter what company you work for. It's a pretty common set of vernacular in the safety industry. I really think about, these when I think about the serious incidents we have had over the years. I can point to one of these 10 life-saving rules and tell you how it relates. What do we do here? So we use behavior-based safety programs to help us enforce these 10 life-saving rules. So we incentivize safe action and we prioritize safety and performance. And so that's done both on a formal basis, so on our annual bonus program, as well as our annual performance targets. Safety is a key component of that. It's the number one thing on the list, actually. So if we don't have a safe year at Ovintiv, it impacts people's compensation. And so that's kind of where the rubber hits the road for folks, is when I have an unsafe act and something happens and it impacts what I get paid, tends to help generate some interest in the topic as well. I think the other thing that we do really well at this company is we do a lot of work on culture, on safety leadership, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But leading from the top is really how you create buy-in and culture. And I think there was a talk on safety culture yesterday, and I don't know if they talked about that at all, but really having your leaders lead the way. That is so critical in an organization, because if I'm a worker working on a task out on a field location and I know that my boss doesn't follow the same types of rules and standards, then why would I? And so that follows all the way up the chain. And so our leadership does a great job of prioritizing safe behavior at the company, and that kind of permeates its way down through the organization in a really effective way. Just wanted to talk about how well you can do on this, how bad you can do on this, and what it looks like. So this is just a plot of, over time at Ovintiv, our total recordable injury frequency. So what is that? Well, that's the count of how many recordable injuries we've had multiplied by an agreed upon standard by the safety industry, divided by the number of exposure hours that are worked. So it's basically a recordable incident rate that's normalized for the amount of hours that are worked. So it allows you to compare incident rates between companies fairly based on the amount of activity that each one has. Because if I'm a really active organization and I have a lot of incidents, that might still be a decent rate compared to someone with a smaller organization with not a lot of activity and not a lot of incidents. And so it's just a way to kind of balance it out, to measure between companies. And so when we look at our recordable injury frequency rate, back in 2003, we were at a 1.70 TRIF. And that's a very high number. And the journey really started at the company back then. Safety started to really become to the forefront in the early mid 2000s. And a lot of effort, like I said, was put into how do we drive this down. And you see orange boxes on here, and you see a 74% reduction since 2009, and it refers to something called Safety Essentials for Leaders implementation. Well, that's a really interesting course, and so that's our core safety leadership program at Ovintiv. We call it CEFL for short, and CEFL was implemented in 2009. It was actually our ex-COO who just retired, came to the safety team and said, what can we do to teach our leaders about safety, safe behavior, and have them understand that if they lead the way on this, the rest of the organization will follow. And so we worked hand in hand with a service provider called Global Energy Safety Canada, and developed this course material ourselves. And, really clarifies our expectations and skills that we expect our frontline workers to have on safety, office workers, like all the way up to the C-suite. And we've also offered it to our service providers who work for us, but are not employees as well. And, since we've implemented it, like you can see the changes in our performance, but we've offered this course now over 200 times, and we've had over 3,500 people through it over the last, 10, 20 years. And so it's really become the flagship of our safety program that we tack in through Ethos' learning management standard. And then also you see on here a little orange box showing since 2013, we've had a 63% reduction. Well, what happened in 2013 was, you can see it, the TRIF popped up a little bit, and we actually experienced a fatality at the organization. And, fatalities are nothing anyone ever wants to happen on their watch, but they have happened in our company's history. And 2013, thankfully, is the last time we've experienced one. Really serves as a point in time for everyone to step back and say, what are we doing and what do we need to do differently? And that's what happened in 2013 is we ended up taking a hard look at everything we were doing, and we made some pretty significant changes to some of our standards. And that's when we brought in our 10 life-saving rules. And so it's really interesting to see how you can influence this type of performance over time, but really the focus is not on what you would expect. It's not on procedure and tactics, it's on leadership. And so it's a bit of my theme here, you're going to see as we go through this, but I think it's really important as new engineers coming into your work lives, understanding how you behave and what you do can influence safety. So I promised a little bit more on risk, and this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but I just want to say that every company I've ever seen who works in safety in any realm has this sort of tool in place, and we call it risk assessment, risk matrix in this case. And it's a kind of a core safety skill, is to be able to step back from any situation and say, gosh, what are the risks here? So what could go wrong? How could it affect me? How likely is it to happen? And what can I do about it? And we've formalized that in this very colorful risk assessment. And so basically you walk through the steps, and it walks you through it. Step one, what's the consequence of the risk that I'm facing? So is it somewhere between a minor consequence all the way up to a really critical consequence? And there's different categories of consequences here. So there's health and safety consequences, environmental, asset or dollar-based, and regulatory consequences. And so you kind of go through and you pick your consequence for the particular risk you're looking at. Then you go on to step two and you talk about how likely is that to occur. So you go through each one and you say, okay, if I think that this is a critical risk, could end up in a fatality, a long-term health impact, a life-threatening or altering injury, or evacuation of a community, how likely is that to occur? And so it's somewhere between rare, unlikely, likely, or common. And so it gives you some likelihood estimates there to help you try and figure that out. But basically each one of your consequences then also has a likelihood associated with it. Then you plot up that in the matrix in step 3, and you determine what risk level you're at. If you're in the green, you're good. The risk is low, it's within tolerance. If you're in the red on the other end, the risk is extreme, and you have to, any of the activity that you're assessing that comes out red has to stop until you can find a way to lower that risk into a lower level. So more often than not, something risks out in either green or in the middle somewhere. And so what we've decided as a company is if anything risks out in a yellow, you either need to, implement more control to get that risk down, or you need to go and talk to your vice president or your GM and your GM, which is the same person, and get their approval to proceed with the risk in place, which quite often, that conversation never ends in a yes. This is about trying to find a way to reduce that risk even further. And then again, if you're in that, deeper green, really, you can complete the assessed activity as well in that zone. It's just, you want to make sure you have really good supervision and you're watching for those things that you've assessed that are very, have the ability to give you those consequences. And then the last step is take action. You have to make sure that everything gets done that you say you're going to do. And really, at the end of the day, I get asked a lot, well, how do you bring something down from a red to a yellow or a yellow to a green? And really, that's about the reverse pyramid you see on the right-hand side of the slide, which is our hierarchy of controls. Well, hierarchy of controls is just how you reduce risk. So you can do anything from eliminate the risk, substitute it for something else, put engineering controls in place to isolate people from the hazards. You can put administrative control in place, change the way that people work so they're not exposed to the risk. And the last line of defense is personal protective equipment. I think this reverse pyramid is really interesting because a lot of people think about safety. They think about wearing their safety glasses or wearing their hard hat or wearing their gloves or their coveralls or their welding pants or whatever it is. But really, PPE should always be your last line of defense. You want to start at the top of the reverse pyramid. Is there a way to completely eliminate the risk? And so, trying to think of a good example off the top of my head, but, if we've got, I think about something recently that's happened. We had a member of our team driving their personal vehicle out to the field, out from Texas to Oklahoma, and a member of the public sideswiped them unexpectedly, not our employee's fault, spun him around, and he rolled 6 times down the interstate at 70 miles an hour. Now, this guy was so lucky. He walked away without a scratch, and, he was driving a big truck, full airbags. He got really lucky. But at the end of the day, we sit back and we look at that incident. We say, well, he wasn't at fault. The member of the public was at fault. Yeah, but if I sit down and I really think about that risk, is there a way to completely eliminate the risk to begin with? Yeah, there is. Why was he driving? Could he have flown out to Oklahoma? That's a 7.5-hour drive. Why was he driving? Well, when we dig into it, we find out that with COVID, the amount of flights out to Oklahoma was severely reduced and he couldn't get a seat on the aircraft. Okay, all right, well, what else could we have done? Well, it turns out he was one of 6 other people that was driving their personal vehicles out to Oklahoma that day because none of them could get seats on the plane. I sit back and say, well, with 6 people, that's an efficient use of company money to charter a plane and take the 6 of them out there, a small plane. So you start to say there was a way to eliminate that risk of having that person driving. So you can work your way down the pyramid from there. If there's no way to eliminate a risk, maybe there's a way to substitute it for something that's less risky. There's a way to implement an engineering control. Engineering control is really easy one to think about is like, guards on rotating equipment, things like that, keeping people away from the risk. In COVID, you think about the plexiglass barriers that we put up. Those are engineering controls. And we'll have another example of this coming up with on COVID, but really thinking about how we can assess risk and how we can control risk is a key job of engineers. Why are engineers so good at risk control? Because we're taught to solve problems in engineering. We're taught to think about big picture, what could go wrong, what would it look like, what could we do about it? And so that's, it's kind of a sticker I carry around all the time. And sorry, I didn't get a chance to scan this, but really thinking about risk in those ways. And that's the simplest way to apply risk on a day-to-day basis, more formally with tools like this. But it's something that is going to be a part of your life, no matter what industry you work in, no matter what job you work in, is trying to come up with ways to protect people from risk. So I wanted to walk through one example and think about for COVID-19 perspective, how we can think about COVID-19 risk and how we can apply those risk controls. And this is just an example of a poster that we have at the company to talk about some of these risk controls for COVID-19. And you know, I like to talk about the upper left here. You see that the different colored blocks with the holes in them. We like to call it the Swiss cheese model we talk about around here for COVID-19. So when you think about the virus making its way towards a person, if you can put these layers of control in between and you think about them like little pieces of Swiss cheese with different shaped and sized holes in every layer, the virus now, instead of getting directly from one place to you, now has to go through a tortuous path of all these different holes and layers, and at some point it gets deadheaded and can't make its way through. That's how I think about COVID-19 risk control, is I want multiple layers of protection. In this case, I want to use those risk control layers of elimination, substitution, engineering, administrative, and PPE. So thinking about those layers, elimination for COVID-19 in the office looks like, you know, making sure that we're obeying our catering protocol, which in this case is we don't have catering available in the building right now. We don't want to take the risk of people sharing utensils. We don't want to take the risk of people sharing food. So we've just eliminated the ability to bring in catering in the building right now. We want people to get vaccinated. We think that'll help eliminate the risk period of the virus, you know, being successful. Performing post-exposure testing at the company is really important. So if we know that someone has had exposure to a confirmed case of COVID-19, making sure that they get access to testing. And so we actually have some private testing available that we can get when times were really tough in COVID and people were waiting days and days and days to get public tests. We had private tests that we could get access to in California. We could turn them around overnight via courier and get people those answers that they needed and be able to get people back to work if we needed to. But really at the end of the day, jurisdictional orders. So in Saskatchewan, provincial health orders. In Alberta provincial health orders, British Columbia, those sorts of things also were eliminative controls for risk because they did things like ask people to stay at home. They did things like ask people to wear a mask. And so it just really, you know, it can be a combination of these things. The next block there on substitution, we think about how we substitute things. A great example of this is, you know, we had cleaners in the buildings every day, normally, using products to clean our offices and all in our field locations as well. So what we did is we went through and we had them all substitute some of the cleaning products they were using with EPA approved cleaning supplies to ensure that we had the right effectiveness against the virus, because there were some particular products, you know, that could be used to make sure that you were killing the virus. And I think the other substitution one that really is quite valid is using virtual meetings. You know, if we'd all had to travel and sit in the same room for this, we're able to substitute a virtual meeting in place and reduce that risk of transmission with all of us together to zero. The next one here is on engineering controls. And so if you think about COVID control, really this was big for us. We went in, did technical analysis on all of our ventilation systems in every building that we have and own and operate in. So making sure that we had the proper filters, making sure we had the proper air circulation rates, putting in physical barriers wherever we needed to with some of our front desk staff, with some of our folks who work in shared trailers, making sure we put up some barriers between them. And then, you know, floor decals, I'm sure everyone's getting used to that, but, you know, we have 550 people in this building here in Calgary, and we have an elevator that can only take 4 people at a time with COVID. So making sure that we've got, you know, holding ability to queue people up to get in those elevators has been really important. And then sanitizer, hand sanitizers everywhere you look in this building, but setting up all those stations in the middle of COVID when hand sanitizer was at a premium and you could barely find it anywhere was something that, you know, that's an engineering control. It took a little bit of finagling to get those all in place, but now we've got barrels of it sitting in the loading dock downstairs if we need it. The next one here is on administrative controls. I think this is really important. I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this when you go to a store or to a service. They ask you the self-screening questions about COVID-19. And so we actually developed an online tool through Microsoft Forms, just something really cheap and easy that everyone every day goes in on their phone or on their tablet, whatever they have, and they do their daily self-screening. It asks you all the questions about temperature and where you've been, have you had exposure, do you have symptoms? And it's just kind of that daily, really honest check on, do you have any signs or symptoms of COVID-19, or have you had exposure to someone who has, just to make sure that, you know, don't even come to the office if you have any of that. It also self-checks against our daily swipe badge system. So we have security badges to get in every building, doesn't matter where we are. And if you haven't filled out the daily self-screening, this thing doesn't work. And if you filled it out with any like, yes, I have symptoms, it doesn't work. And big guys come and escort you out of the building. No, I'm just kidding. It's not that bad. But you have to have some administrative control. We had to know how many people were in our buildings and when, and, you know, how were they doing on their self-screening? And, you know, we sit at about usually a 95% success rate on that. And most times the unsuccessful are just, oh gosh, sorry, I picked yes instead of no most of the time. And so it's a good check every day. And then the last one, we talked about PPE, and that one's pretty visual. Wearing face coverings has been, you know, a big way to cut down exposure to COVID-19. You know, 3-layer, fits snugly. Don't wear it under your nose, right? How many of you have had to go around and correct people in stores? But really, you know, we've gone as far as utilizing some N95s in some of our locations as well, depending on how well we think we've been able to do with barriers and spacing and ventilation as well. So kind of all these things combined, but this really practical example helps you see how you can take something from being what seems like a very, very scary risk, and you can take it down to a real practical management place where we've had, you know, hundreds of people in our offices since June, and we've had zero transmission of the virus on our work sites. And so that's something that, you know, not a lot of companies have done yet. A lot of our peer companies in Calgary are not back in the office at all yet, or in Houston or in Denver. And we feel like we've been really successful by approaching COVID-19 like we do in any operational risk and managing our way through it. All right, that's my COVID-19 pitch, but a little bit more on leadership, because I want to really hit with this, with especially with engineers. This is something that is not, you know, not something that you're going to expect, but it's something that is going to really help you be successful, is thinking about how you and your leadership can matter on safety management. How do you show up on location when you're there? And so this is the DuPont Bradley curve. It really walks you through how people start out thinking about safety in a really reactive way, generally. So safety by natural instinct, compliance is their only goal, really thinking that safety is safety department's problem, not mine. And so, Kim, that's your team, right? That's kind of where safety culture starts. And where you really want it to get to is the other end of this spectrum, where you get this interdependent safety culture, where you're helping others, where you're looking out for everyone else that you work with. You're also helping through your network, helping people understand some of the challenges and that care for others, and having a great pride in your organization and this being your number one value. And so there's kind of a spectrum all the way there, but really goes from I follow the rules because I have to, all the way through to I follow the rules because I want to. And so how do we as engineers encourage others to move from that compliance to commitment? It takes a believer to create belief. So your belief has to be visible, it has to be felt, has to be credible, and it has to be a core value to you. Otherwise, people will be onto you that it's not, and they will stay on the reactive side of the spectrum. I think something that engineers can do is develop your own personal safety slogan and pitch it. So what is it? Safety is my highest value. I don't know, there's thousands of them. But really, if you think about what's going to be what you say when you are out in the field talking to folks, walking the talk, and being consistent and making sure you do it every time. I think using emotions and not just reason to make our case is really important. I find as engineers, people want us to tell them relatable stories, things that we can do to interact with others, to share our experiences. I saw a lot of questions in the pre-work about stopping work and rights. I think this one's really important, is as a good safety leader, you need to be able to execute a stop work if you need to. As the engineer on site, a lot of people are going to look to you as a senior person. And really, if you see something unsafe happening, not only do you have the right, but you have the responsibility to stop it, to stop the work, gather everyone up, talk about what you see, what you think is unsafe, and if it's a risk, to truly address it and bring it down to a level that people are comfortable with. Now, this could be something happening, or you could be even your perception of someone doing something without the proper training or without the proper knowledge. And so I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a location and had to stop work. It's in the hundreds, but it's not as formal and scary as it sounds. This is just a simple, hey, can we have 5 minutes before we move on to the next step so I can understand what we're doing here a little bit better. It can look as simple as that, or it can look as formal as Kim's walked onto a site and like pressed the ESD button and called everyone together, right? So it has a spectrum, but it starts, if you can keep it small and keep it simple, those are the ones that a lot of you are going to have those experiences over time. And speaking up when you see unsafe acts or anything you perceive that way, like I said, is your right, but it's also your responsibility, especially as a professional engineer. Your first duty is going to be to protect the public, number one. And so anytime you see something, it's now your responsibility as well. I think the other question we get around this a lot is, what if I'm being asked to do something that's unsafe? Well, you absolutely have the right to refuse to do that work, and take it to your supervisor and say, this is why I'm doing it. They then have the legal obligation everywhere across North America to stop the work and do an investigation. And so that's a question I get asked often, and I would encourage you to do it, especially when you're new to a role or new to the knowledge or procedures of a site. You know, just really finding someone that you can ask. And then if it gets to the point where it's too far, you can execute that stop work for yourself as well. I think the last thing is, I always try and use the word incident. I never try and use the word accident, because really in my mind, there are no accidents. We work purposefully and with safety top of mind, and nothing is left to chance when you're good at risk management. So no job is so important that it can't be done safely, is kind of my theme there. So quickly here, I just wanted to talk about, how does my company measure analytically safety performance? This is a good example. This is our scorecard, our environment, health, and safety scorecard from 2020. Basically down the left side, it shows the categories that we measure on performance. So everything from recordable injuries down to reportable spills. Reportable in this case means to a government agency. So in Alberta, to our Alberta energy regulator, recordable injuries are as recordable to the Alberta OH&S, occupational health and safety. I think it's called the same thing in Saskatchewan occupational health and safety. And so you see different columns on here, but really it's comparing year over year. How did we do in the fourth quarter of 2019 to the fourth quarter of 2020, and 2019 full year to 2020 full year. And so we have, like I said, those counts of recordable injuries, as well as that total recordable injury frequency, and then a judgment in green, yellow, or red. And so this helps you see really quickly, especially if you're at the management level, how are we doing? If this thing is all green, it feels really good. When it starts to turn yellow, when it starts to turn red, you start to have to really worry about what's going on, what's happening. Do we have anything systemic happening in our organization that we need to stop and take a look at? But I can tell you that even when it's green, this doesn't mean you can let off the gas and be like, hey, everything's great. This means that you're always watching for that. What's the next thing that might happen? What are those next risks that we need to address? And even in a year here, you can see our motor vehicle incidents. We had 0 motor vehicle incidents in 2020. There's a record for the company. That's never happened before. I can already tell you in 2021, we've had 1. And so it can change at any time. This can go from green to red in a heartbeat. And so it's just that constant, got to constantly be monitoring this and working at improving, continuous improvement over time. So thinking about 2021, what do we do? Well, when we have a year like that, when everything's all green, I sit with the board and they say, well, where do you want to set the targets for 2021, Kim? I say, harder than 2020 is kind of where I want to set them. And so these are how we've set our targets for 2021. But really, I can sum it up with every single category has continuous improvement associated with it. And not only just improvement in counts, but improvement in that relative performance, knowing that we're going to do less activity in 2021 versus 2020. So I actually account for the lowered activity level and say we should do better relativistically on all of these things. And some of the questions I had in advance and things we've talked about, hey, how does environmental fit into your role? And I kind of wanted to close out talking about that. And you see a couple of things here. You see our safety piece on targeting a 5% improvement in our recordable injury frequency. Our serious events, we want to have a lower count than last year. We talk about our spill intensity, a 10% reduction in liquid spilled. So what's a spill intensity? Well, it's how much liquid you spill in the ground divided by how much liquid you handle. So it's kind of how much are you spilling for how much that you're actually moving around and carrying. So we wanted to improve that year over year. That's part of our environmental performance. Also, part of environmental performance, something called significant spills. So those are spills that are greater than 10 barrels. So if you think about a barrel sitting on the ground, 10 of those together, that's a pretty big spill. And so we wanted to be able to reduce the amount of significant spills we were having, because of course those create the most environmental harm as well as have the costliest cleanup and associated with them. And so that's one of our big targets for the year. Also, we are targeting a reduction in our flaring and venting at the company by 12% year over year. That's a big reduction. When do we do flaring and venting? Well, really, in Canada, it's only in emergency situations at large facilities where you have to depressurize vessels quickly, perhaps in an emergency situation, things like that. In the US, the regulatory environment is a little bit different. There is a certain amount of flaring and venting allowed on some of our sites, depending on design, depending on how the particular environment is in that state. And so that's where a lot of our opportunity is coming right now, is by taking a consistent approach across North America to all of our flaring and venting and really designing our facilities to minimize it completely, if not totally eliminate it. So we're kind of on a journey, I would say, on flaring and venting, and compared to when I first started in the industry to now, it's a huge difference, and it's just going to continue, being a focus for us. And then the last one you see here is on methane intensity. What's methane intensity about? Well, methane, of course, is a greenhouse gas. It's 25 times the potency of any other constituent of greenhouse gases to climate change. And so it's a really important thing for us to focus on. So we're focused on reducing the intensity of how much methane comes off of our operations. We're trying to get to a 33% reduction from 2019 levels by 2025. And, this is insider information, but I can tell you that we're making amazing progress on this. And I am looking forward to telling my boss that it's time to actually make a harder target, probably by the middle of the year, because we're basically there now. And so something that, we've put a ton of work into in the last 2 years is, reducing the amount of pneumatic controllers that we have on our locations that vent little puffs of fuel gas to actuate valves or actuate pumps. Taking and electrifying some of our fuel gas systems so we can use instrument air compressors to power things, electrifying some of our large facilities in British Columbia where our power is sourced from hydroelectric power. There's so many examples. It'd make your head spin, but really this is a conscious effort to do better as an industry, and we realize that we want to be on the leading edge of this, and it's something that is really important in today's society and to our investors and to the general public. So it's something we've been working on. So this is the corporate slide on how we're doing on environmental leadership. And, I think the thing I'm most proud of is I work at a company that's been doing sustainability reporting as a company for over 16 years, for as almost as long as I've been at the company, we've been publishing how we do in this space. And, not a lot of people read those reports, but I feel like we've made progress on this every year of those 16 years. I think the other thing that we do is we do get scored by third-party environmental, social, and governance companies, ESG companies, and we have really good rankings. And so you see some of those at the bottom of the page there, but we really do well when you compare to our peers. And I think the other piece I would say here is that our board has really led the way on this. I remember sitting at a board meeting 2 years ago where I got asked to start engaging on this topic and really driving the performance of the company on this. And that's how some of these environmental targets come to be, is they get driven down from the board level. I think I'm almost out of time, but just wanted to kind of close off with, I got asked, what do you wish that you'd known before you left Saskatoon? And these are some of them, and I just want to hit on a couple. But really, I think for me, we're all great technical engineers. I think there's no question U of S generates some of the highest qualified technical folks in the space. But what I can tell you about that is that that's going to be really important in your career, but so is your approach. So you're not going to survive solely on your technical ability. So how do you work with other folks? How do you interact? How do you lead? How do you, really make those connections with people? And that's going to be more important than you probably think it will. And I wish someone had told me about that, because it's such a big part of my career now. I think the other one is about leading from any chair that you sit in. So it doesn't matter what job you have at a company, you can provide leadership from any chair in that company, and whether it's on safety or whether it's on any general type of leadership. Don't wait to be asked, step up to the plate and do what you know is right in your heart, is kind of how I think about leading from any chair. And I think the last one I wanted to talk about is the second last bullet there: eat whatever's put in front of you. This is the best piece of advice I ever got from a leader. Was sometimes you're going to put a plate of spaghetti in front of you that's not particularly appetizing, but what you're being asked to do is eat that plate of spaghetti and probably lick the plate when you're done. And that's gonna, your ability to take on those tough assignments and roles and things no one else wants to do is gonna differentiate you over time and allow you to develop more as an engineer, as a person, and into your career. So that would be one of my biggest pieces of advice now too. I think that's it. Michelle, I don't know how we want to go from here, but I really enjoyed the time today.
That was fantastic, Kim. Thank you so much. That was really comprehensive and informative. I took a lot out of that, so I can only imagine that the students that were listening in also really enjoyed it. I had prepared some questions that were pulled from students in advance, and you actually hit a lot of the themes that they had touched upon. So if anyone did have any other questions for Kim that they wanted to put out there, I see that we do have one from Lee, who is wondering how he could determine who your peers are. I'm always curious about those rankings. So I think he's wondering who the third-party ESG reviewers are, where he can find those reports to see how the companies are doing. So if you could flip that back at some point, or if it's on that slide there, Lee, if you
I
want to have
think
a
MSCI is probably a really good one to start with. They're one of the largest. Sustainalytics as well, ISS, and then the Dow Jones Sustainability. There's a lot of companies in this space who do this ranking, but really how they determine our peer set is often on size of company, on market capitalization, or on size of production for oil and gas companies. There's a lot of different ways, but generally they define it in the report.
great. Great. So if anyone else did have any questions, feel free to chime in the chat or unmute yourself and ask. I recognize we are coming up on the end of the hour, so if you do have to hop off, that's totally fine too. I'll quickly just mention before you do sign off that tomorrow we have our session on mental health and wellness. You're going to receive the recording this evening for that session, and you have 48 hours to review it, so be sure to check that out while we still have access to that session, and then you can complete your quiz and whatnot when you have an opportunity. But give a big round of thanks to Kim for this incredible session that we've had. And if you have the time, I encourage you to stay on after and chat if you're able to. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thanks, Hayden. Yeah, I had shortlisted some